This video was brought to you by Brilliant. The first 200 people to use the link below get 20% off an annual subscription. In response to Putin's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, the West has implemented some unprecedented sanctions. We've talked about how these sanctions will affect Russia's economy in a few other videos, but in this one, we're going to be taking a look at whether these sanctions could hurt America. Since the US dollar is the world reserve currency, it holds a lot of leverage over countries that have the dollar in their foreign currency reserves. Although many countries are now starting to reevaluate whether they should keep US dollars or now switch to a new alternative, like the euro or the Chinese yuan. In this video, we'll take a look at what is a reserve currency, how the US became the reserve currency, and what is changing now that might threaten that dominance. First, let's define what reserve currency is. As the name suggests, a reserve currency is any currency that banks or big financial institutions hold in large quantities. In other words, hold in reserve. Financial institutions usually hold reserve currencies because they consider the currency safe, i.e. they think it'll hold its value. Reserve currencies have come and gone. Perhaps the first proper reserve currency was the Spanish silver dollar, which became the currency of choice in Europe, Asia and the Americas in the 16th century. Today, though, the United States dollar is by far and away the world's favourite reserve currency. Dollars make up 60% of the world's reserves, substantially more than any other country. The euro, which is in second place, represents just 20%, and no other currency represents more than 10%. The dollar really became the world's reserve currency after World War II, when Britain, who previously had the world's reserve currency in the pound, and other allies, had to borrow substantial amounts of money from the United States to finance the war effort. Many of these countries paid the US in gold, which meant that by the end of the war, the US had an astonishing 75% of all gold held by national authorities. The 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement tied the dollar to gold, which made the dollar by far and away the world's reserve currency, because countries could hold dollars safe in the knowledge that they could convert it to gold if need be. Nixon infamously ditched the gold standard in 1971, but the US dollar maintained its status as the world's reserve currency, in large part thanks to what's known as the petrodollar system. Essentially, in 1973, the US and Saudi Arabia agreed to price trade oil in US dollars. This basically meant that any country buying oil from the Saudis had to use dollars. This led to many other oil-producing countries to start standardizing their oil prices in US dollars, and by the 80s, practically all oil transactions were denominated in dollars. This meant you needed dollars to pay for oil, hence the name petrodollars. And because, well, everybody wanted oil, so everybody wanted dollars. Anyway, you get the point. The dollar has been the world's reserve currency since World War II, and this gives the US what's often called an exorbitant privilege, a term first used in the 1960s by the French Minister of Finance. Essentially, the US enjoys some unique financial advantages thanks to the dollar's status. For starters, the US doesn't have any exchange risk, because all foreign currencies take dollars. Second, the US can never have a currency crisis, which is basically when a country runs out of foreign exchange reserves, because, well, it can just print more dollars. The US government can also borrow more cheaply than other countries because there's massive international demand for dollars. Now, it's worth saying that there are also disadvantages to having a reserve currency. For example, the massive global demand for the dollar makes the dollar more expensive, and therefore makes Americans' exports less competitive. This has probably contributed to the decline of American manufacturing, which, as we all know, has had massive political consequences, but most analysts still think it's a net advantage. Anyway, you get the idea. The US dollar has been the world's reserve currency for nearly 100 years, bestowing the US with this exorbitant privilege. However, some analysts think that the dollar's hegemony is finally coming to an end as a consequence of the West's unprecedented sanctions on Russia. There are basically two arguments here. First, the US's unprecedented decision to freeze Russia's central bank dollar reserves might make other central banks wary of holding too many dollars because, well, they could be frozen. Countries that could plausibly face US sanctions in the future will now be wary of holding too many dollars in reserve. This would reduce demand for the dollar in international reserves. Second, Russia's oil exports could end up being denominated in some other currency, like the ruble, because sanctions mean that Russia can't really use the US dollar. Putin has already tried to get European countries to pay in rubles, and while this hasn't happened so far, it's still definitely a possibility. This would threaten the petrodollar system described earlier, which would reduce demand for dollars and therefore the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. It's not just Russia either. Saudi Arabia has also been flirting with the idea of taking oil payments in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars. Now, it's worth saying that this is all speculative at this point, and so far nothing has happened. Putin backtracked on this threat to only accept gas payments in rubles, and Saudi Arabia and China are yet to formalise any agreement. The dollar has also had a massive incumbency bias thanks to what's known as network effects. Essentially, everybody already uses the dollar, so switching to a different currency is difficult. Furthermore, there's no obvious replacement. The yuan is perhaps the most obvious contender, but it's a long way off. 40% of SWIFT payments are conducted in US dollars, while only 3% are conducted in yuan, and the US dollar accounts for about 60% of all foreign currency reserves, while the yuan only accounts for about 2%, on par with that of the Canadian dollar. Furthermore, it's not actually clear that the CCP actually wants the yuan to be a global reserve currency, at least in the near future, because it would make controlling the yuan's exchange rate a lot more difficult. All in all, it's probably too early to say. There's reasons to think that the US's unprecedented sanctions could mark the beginning of the end for the dollar's dominance, but the dollar has proved remarkably secure as the world's reserve currency for the best part of 100 years now. This video was brought to you by Brilliant.
Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform that turns complex subjects into fun and interactive experiences. I actually did a computer science degree, and I've loved exploring Brilliant to refresh my skills, as well as learning new ones to help with my current job, like their superb statistics courses. But you don't need any kind of background in STEM. If you just want to spend a bit of time building your skills, then you can do it right away, with no long boring lectures like the ones I had to sit through. Sorry to my former university. Instead, you can learn through interactive games and puzzles, the kind of thing you actually want to do. There's something at all levels too, with more advanced courses on things like neural networks and even quantum computing. Just pick a course that you're interested in and get started. They're all designed by award-winning instructors and built upon the principle of active learning, so you're gaining STEM knowledge by actually doing it. Brilliant helps you learn new things and sharpen your skills. So if you want to improve with STEM, then you should sign up to Brilliant at brilliant.org/TLDR US. And the first 200 people to do so will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks so much for supporting the channel.